The weight of silence can be heavier than any sound. In the dim morning light, I stand across the street watching the church where I spent 20 years of my life. Its white paint is peeling now. The sign that once gleamed with golden letters hangs crooked, swaying gently in the October breeze. This was my home. Until it wasn't. I remember the day they told me I wasn't needed anymore. Their voices were soft, pastoral even, wrapped in scripture and cloaked in righteous certainty. We're taking the church in a new direction, they said. We need people who are visible, who contribute in ways that elevate our mission. The irony still burns like acid in my throat. I was the invisible foundation that held everything together, and they couldn't even see it. For 2 decades, I was the first to arrive and the last to leave. I organized the food drives that fed hundreds. I cleaned bathrooms when no one was looking. I balanced the books when the finances were in shambles. I counseled the broken-hearted women who couldn't get appointments with the pastors. I arranged the flowers that everyone complimented, but no one knew who placed. I was everywhere and nowhere all at once. You might wonder why I stayed silent through it all. Why I never demanded recognition, never stood at the pulpit to remind them of my contributions. The truth is both simple and complex. I believed service without recognition was the purest form of faith. I believed God saw what others didn't. I believed in humility as a virtue, not a weakness. How terribly naive I was. They didn't fire me in one dramatic moment. It was death by 1,000 cuts. First, they removed me from the financial committee. We need fresh eyes, they said. Then they asked someone else to coordinate the charity programs I'd built from nothing. You seem overwhelmed, they offered as explanation. Finally, they suggested I take a break from my volunteer duties altogether. Focus on your spiritual journey, they advised with practiced concern. Si esta historia, te esta tocando, comenta aquae abajo, desde donde estás viendo esta huachahora es ali. What they really meant was become invisible completely. The shadow work I did was no longer valued in a church increasingly obsessed with image, with performance, with metrics of success that could be projected on screens and shared on social media. My quiet diligence didn't translate to their language of spectacle. Do you know what it's like to be erased from a community you helped build? To watch as your life's work is dismissed as insignificant? To be told that your form of devotion is somehow less than? It's like having the air slowly pulled from your lungs while everyone around you continues to breathe normally, unaware that you're suffocating. The final meeting was brief. Pastor James and the board members sat across from me, their faces a careful blend of regret and resolve. We're restructuring church leadership, they explained. And we feel your role is redundant. They offered platitudes about my years of service, about how God would surely guide me to where I was truly needed. They even prayed over me, asking for blessings on my new journey. I didn't cry, not then. I nodded, thanked them for the opportunity to serve, and walked out with my dignity intact. It wasn't until I reached my car that the trembling began, violent shudders that racked my body, as 20 years of devotion collapsed into rubble around me. I didn't drive home immediately. I couldn't. Instead, I sat there, watching the church lights dim one by one as they locked up for the night, unaware that they had just cut out the heart that kept their sanctuary alive. That was 6 months ago. I haven't set foot inside those walls since then, but I've watched and I've waited, because deep down I knew what would happen next. The first signs of trouble appeared within weeks. Small things, barely noticeable to those who didn't know where to look. The church bulletin, once meticulously organized and error-free, began showing up with typos, misaligned columns, and outdated information. The flower arrangements became sparse, then disappeared altogether. The coffee after service, which I had prepared every Sunday without fail, was sometimes forgotten. Sometimes bitter, sometimes cold. I heard about these changes from Sarah, the only member who still called me regularly. Sarah had been in my women's Bible study group for years. She was the kind of friend who noticed things, the slight tremble in a voice, the shadow behind a smile. She noticed my absence immediately. It's not the same without you, she told me one evening over the phone. No one knows where anything is. Pastor James spent 15 minutes looking for communion cups last Sunday. They were right where they've always been, in the cabinet you labeled 3 years ago. I didn't respond with satisfaction. That's not who I am, even now. Instead, I felt a hollow ache. The church had been my purpose for so long that its struggles felt like my own, even after rejection. That's the complicated truth about devotion. It doesn't simply switch off like a light. The financial reports are a mess too, Sarah continued. They asked for volunteers to take over the bookkeeping, but no one wants to touch it. They don't understand your system. My system. 20 years of carefully crafted organizational methods, designed to keep everything running smoothly, even with limited resources. The filing cabinet in the church office contained labeled folders for every vendor, donor, and expense category. The computer spreadsheets were backed up in 3 different places. I had created contingency plans for everything from power outages during services to funding shortfalls during slow donation periods. None of it was complicated, just thorough, consistent, and invisible when working properly. Like the foundation of a house, my systems were never meant to be seen or praised. They were meant to support everything else. By the 3rd month, the problems had grown more serious. The heating system broke down during the coldest week of winter. No one knew which company had serviced it before, or where to find the maintenance records. The repairs cost triple what they should have, depleting the emergency fund I had carefully built over years of budget planning. The Wednesday night meal program, which fed dozens of homeless people each week, began to falter. The volunteer schedule I had maintained disappeared, leading to nights when too many helpers showed up, and others when almost none did. Food went to waste. People who depended on those meals went hungry. The church's reputation in the community, built through years of reliable service, began to crack. Still, I stayed away. Not out of spite, I'm not that person, but because returning would have been a form of self-betrayal. They had decided I wasn't valuable. Going back would mean accepting that assessment, becoming the supplicant begging for re-entry. Instead, I channeled my energy elsewhere. I volunteered at the public library, organizing their donation system. I joined a community garden, applying the same diligence to growing vegetables that I once gave to growing ministries. I found new spaces where quiet competence was appreciated, even if not celebrated. I began to rebuild. But at night, alone in my house, I sometimes found myself writing out schedules for church events I was no longer part of, planning budgets for programs I would never manage again. Old habits die slowly, and purpose is not easily redirected. 4 months after my departure, Sarah called with news that should have vindicated me, but only deepened my sadness. "They've cancelled the youth mission trip," she said, her voice heavy. No one could figure out how to coordinate all the details, and the deadline for deposits passed without anyone noticing. The kids are devastated. That mission trip had been my special project for 15 years. I had built relationships with the hosts' communities, negotiated lower travel costs, maintained spreadsheets of participant information, and handled the 1,000 invisible details that made such trips possible. Hundreds of teenagers had experienced life-changing moments of service because of that program. Now it was gone, another casualty of my absence. "They're starting to talk about you," Sarah admitted. Not by name usually, just before and after. As in, before, the sound system always worked, or after. Nobody knows where the baptism robes are stored. I closed my eyes, feeling the strange dual emotions of vindication and grief. They were finally seeing me, but only through the space I had left behind. The real collapse began in the 5th month. On a rainy Sunday morning, Pastor James stood before a half-empty sanctuary and announced that the church was facing financial challenges. What he meant, as Sarah later explained to me, was that they had discovered a $30,000 shortfall in the operating budget. Bills were piling up. Salaries were in jeopardy. I could have told them exactly how this happened. The church had always operated on razor-thin margins, sustainable only through careful monitoring and timely interventions. When donations dipped in summer months, I would send gentle reminder letters to regular contributors. When unexpected expenses arose, I knew exactly which budget lines had flexibility and which were sacred. I maintained relationships with vendors who would extend payment terms when necessary. All of this knowledge walked out the door with me, unrecorded because it lived in my experience, not in any manual. Pastor asked if anyone knew how to access the reserve fund. Sarah told me during our weekly call. No one even knew it existed. I closed my eyes, remembering how carefully I had built that fund over 15 years. Small amounts diverted from each month's surplus, placed in a separate account that would sustain the church through exactly this kind of crisis. The account information was in my records, of course, records they had apparently never bothered to review. "Did you tell them?" I asked. Sarah hesitated. "I wanted to, but it felt like betraying you somehow." I sighed, feeling the familiar weight of responsibility I couldn't quite shake. "It's not betraying me to help the church, Sarah." "But they betrayed you," she said, an edge in her voice that surprised me. Sarah had always been the peacemaker, the one who saw both sides. Now she sounded angry on my behalf in a way I had never allowed myself to be. The fund is at First National, I told her after a long pause. Account number 874229. Pastor James and the treasurer are both signatories. But they need to bring the church's tax ID documentation. Sarah was quiet for a moment. You still care about them? After everything? Did I? The question haunted me for days afterward. Was giving Sarah this information an act of compassion or a desperate attempt to remain relevant, to prove my worth even in absence? I didn't know anymore. The lines between devotion and dependency had blurred long ago. What I did know was that the church, not the leadership, but the community, the purpose, the mission, still mattered to me. I had given 2 decades of my life to building something that served others. Watching it crumble brought me no joy, regardless of how I'd been treated. A week later, Sarah reported that they had accessed the reserve fund. Pastor James announced it like a miracle. God has provided for our needs, he said. No mention of who actually provided by creating that account. I smiled sadly at this. It was so familiar, the work of human hands repackaged as divine intervention. How many times had my careful planning been credited to God's perfect timing or heavenly provision? I never minded this theological sleight of hand before. Now it stung in unexpected ways. The reserve fund bought them time but didn't solve the underlying problems. The church's operations continued to deteriorate. The children's ministry, once a vibrant program with dedicated volunteers and engaging activities, dwindled to a few kids watching videos in the basement. The outreach programs I'd nurtured lost momentum without my constant coordination. Even the Sunday service, the centerpiece of church life, began to fray around the edges as technical issues multiplied and small details went unaddressed. They've started a search committee, Sarah informed me in month 6, looking for an administrative director. The job description is basically everything you did, except they're offering an actual salary now. The irony wasn't lost on me. For years, I'd done that work as a volunteer, motivated by faith and commitment rather than compensation. Now they were willing to pay someone to do what they had dismissed as dispensable. Will you apply? Sarah asked hesitantly. The question landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through my carefully constructed detachment. Would I? Could I walk back into that place, submit my resume, sit through interviews with people who had rejected me, and politely pretend none of it had happened? Would I accept their belated recognition that the work I did mattered, that it required skill and dedication, that it deserved compensation? No, I said finally. I can't go backward. But even as I said it, I wondered if moving forward was possible without some kind of resolution. The church still occupied too much space in my heart. The wound of rejection still felt fresh despite the months that had passed. That night, I dreamed of the church. In my dream, I walked through empty halls, turning off lights, locking doors, straightening hymnals, all the small acts of care I had performed countless times. But in the dream, the building was transforming around me, crumbling in some places, reshaping in others. I woke with tears on my face and a decision forming in my mind. I didn't plan to return, not really, but on a Sunday morning, in the 7th month of my exile, something pulled me toward the familiar white building with its crooked sign. I parked across the street, as I had done many times since my departure, intending only to watch. But today was different. Today I turned off the engine, stepped out of my car, and crossed the street. I didn't enter through the main doors. Instead, I used the side entrance, the one near the kitchen that I had used hundreds of times when arriving early to prepare for events. It was unlocked, as it always had been during service times, despite my repeated suggestions about security protocols. The hallway smelled different, mustier, with a faint undertone of neglect. The bulletin board that I had updated weekly was covered with outdated announcements, some from before my departure. The floors, which I had ensured were always polished to a soft shine, were dull and streaked with shoe marks. I moved silently, staying close to the walls, using my intimate knowledge of the building to remain undetected. I could hear Pastor James's voice echoing from the sanctuary, delivering his sermon to what sounded like a sparse congregation. I slipped into the balcony, keeping to the shadows, and looked down at what remained of my church family. The change was stark. Where once 200 people had filled the pews, now barely 50 sat scattered throughout the space. The worship team, once a polished ensemble of 8 musicians, had dwindled to a guitarist and a pianist who seemed to be struggling to stay in sync. The projection system displayed slides with typographical errors and mismatched formatting. Even the sanctuary itself had a diminished quality. Dead plants in corners, dusty windowsills, burned-out bulbs in light fixtures. As I watched, Pastor James wiped his forehead with a handkerchief. He looked tired, older somehow, his customary confidence replaced by something that resembled desperation. "We must come together in this difficult time," he was saying. "The challenges we face as a congregation require unity and sacrifice from all of us." The irony wasn't lost on me. These were almost the exact words he had used when explaining why my services were no longer required. Unity and sacrifice, but only certain kinds from certain people, delivered in certain ways. I should have felt vindicated. Here was visible proof that my contributions had mattered, that my absence had consequences. Instead, I felt a profound sadness. This diminished version of the church represented years of collective effort and devotion. It wasn't just my work being wasted, but the investments of countless people who had believed in this community. After the service, I remained hidden as the sparse congregation filtered out. Many faces I recognized were absent. New faces had taken their places, but there were too few of them to fill the void. I waited until the building was nearly empty before making my way down to the main level and toward the church office. The office door was open. Inside, Pastor James sat at his desk, head in hands, surrounded by scattered papers. He looked up as my shadow fell across the threshold, his eyes widening in shock. "Marie?" His voice was barely a whisper, as though he was seeing a ghost. I stood very still, suddenly uncertain of why I had come or what I wanted to say. The rehearsed speeches that had played in my mind during sleepless nights evaporated, leaving only raw emotion and unanswered questions. "The reserve fund won't last forever," I said finally. It wasn't what I had planned to say, but it was true and practical, the language I had always spoken best. He stared at me, momentarily confused, then understanding dawned. "You know about that? I created it," I reminded him gently, "along with most of the systems that kept this place functioning." Pastor James looked down at the papers on his desk, financial statements, from what I could see, showing figures in red. "We've made mistakes," he admitted, "many of them." The understatement was so profound that I almost laughed. Instead, I stepped into the office and gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "May I?" He nodded, watching me wearily as I sat down. Up close, the fatigue in his face was even more apparent. The church's struggles had taken a toll on him too. "Why did you come back?" he asked after a moment of uncomfortable silence. It was a good question, one I was still answering for myself. "I'm not sure," I said honestly. "Maybe to see if it was as bad as I imagined. Maybe to remind myself why leaving was necessary." "And is it as bad as you imagined?" I looked around the cluttered office, remembering how organized it had been under my care. "It's worse." He flinched slightly, but didn't deny it. "We've lost nearly half the congregation. Donations are down 60%. 3 staff members have resigned. The building itself is starting to deteriorate faster than we can address." I nodded, unsurprised by these specifics. "You've also lost your credibility in the community. The homeless ministry has collapsed. The youth program is barely functioning. And I'm guessing the annual Christmas outreach is in jeopardy." Pastor James looked at me with newfound respect, or perhaps it was just recognition of what had always been there but never acknowledged. "You really did know everything that was happening here, didn't you?" "Not everything," I corrected. "Just all the things that no one else was paying attention to. The infrastructure, the details, the connections between different parts of church life." We sat in silence for a long moment, the weight of unspoken words filling the space between us. Outside the office window, autumn leaves skittered across the church parking lot, mostly empty now. Where once it had overflowed with vehicles every Sunday. "We tried to replace you," Pastor James finally said. "We created a paid position. Administrative director." I heard he looked surprised. "From who?" "I still have friends here." I didn't elaborate further, unwilling to complicate Sarah's position. Pastor James sighed heavily. "We had 3 candidates. None of them worked out. The first quit after 2 weeks, said the job was impossible. The second couldn't make sense of the financial systems. The third just didn't show up one day. I could have told them this would happen. The role I had filled wasn't just about tasks and schedules. It was about institutional memory, about understanding the complex ecosystem of relationships and traditions that made up church life. It was knowledge that couldn't be transferred in a 2-week training period or captured in a procedures manual. "What do you want, Marie?" Pastor James asked directly. "Did you come back to say I told you so?" Because message received, you were right, we were wrong. The church is falling apart without you. His bluntness surprised me. In all our years working together, Pastor James had never been so direct with me. Our interactions had always been couched in spiritual language and careful politeness. This raw acknowledgement of reality felt new and strangely refreshing. I didn't come to gloat, I said. I'm not even sure why I came. But seeing all this ... I gestured vaguely, indicating the church beyond the office walls. It hurts. Still, after everything, would you consider coming back? The question emerged tentatively, almost fearfully, not as a volunteer this time. As paid staff, the administrative director position is still open. The offer hung in the air between us. 6 months ago, it might have been all I wanted to hear. Recognition, validation, compensation for the work that had consumed so much of my life. Now, I wasn't so sure. Why was I asked to leave in the first place? I countered, needing to understand before I could even consider his offer. Pastor James shifted uncomfortably in his chair. The board ... we were implementing a new vision. More contemporary worship, more visible leadership, more ... double quotes. He hesitated. More flash, less substance, I suggested. He winced, but didn't disagree. We were trying to attract younger members, grow the church numerically. Your work was behind the scenes, invisible. Some board members questioned your value because they couldn't see what you did. They only saw the results when everything worked smoothly. It was exactly as I had suspected, but hearing it confirmed still stung. And you went along with it. I did. He met my eyes directly. It was a mistake. One of many I've made. The admission was unexpected. In all my imagined confrontations with church leadership, I had never pictured such straightforward acceptance of responsibility. It disarmed me slightly, though it didn't erase the hurt. The irony, I said slowly, is that I never wanted recognition. I believed service was its own reward, but being erased, being told my contributions didn't matter. I paused, struggling with emotions I had suppressed for months. That was different. Pastor James nodded, seemingly understanding the distinction. We didn't just fail to recognize your work, we actively devalued it. And now we're paying the price. Outside the office. The church building creaked and settled as if emphasizing his point. The sound was familiar to me. The old heating system coming on, struggling a bit before finding its rhythm. It needed maintenance that had clearly been neglected. So what happens now? I asked. He spread his hands in a gesture of uncertainty. That depends partly on you. If you came back, could you help us rebuild? Not just the systems and programs, but trust? The congregation's trust in leadership. The community's trust in our mission? It was a loaded question, weighted with implications I wasn't sure I was ready to address. Could I help them rebuild? Probably. The practical aspects of church operations could be repaired with time and effort. But did I want to? That was more complicated. I need to think about it, I said finally. This isn't a decision I can make right now. Pastor James nodded, seemingly relieved that I hadn't immediately rejected the idea. Take whatever time you need. The offer stands. As I rose to leave, he added, And Marie? Regardless of what you decide. I'm sorry. Truly, we should have seen your value before we lost it. The apology was sincere, I could tell. But it also came too late to simply erase the pain of the past 6 months. I nodded in acknowledgement but made no promises as I left the office and made my way back through the quiet, neglected hallways of my former spiritual home. As I reached my car, I noticed Sarah standing near the church entrance, watching me with a mix of surprise and hope. I hadn't told her I was coming today, but somehow her presence felt right. A bridge between my past and whatever future I might choose. You came back, she said simply as she approached. Just to see, I clarified. Not to stay. At least, not yet. Sarah nodded, understanding as always. They need you. Maybe, I conceded. But that doesn't mean I need them. The next week passed in a strange limbo of consideration and memory. I found myself pulling out old church bulletins I had saved, files of programs I had created, photographs of events I had organized. Tangible evidence of my years of service that had once seemed meaningful but now carried the taint of rejection. I made lists, pro and con, about returning to the church. On the pro side, the community I had loved, the mission I still believed in, the satisfaction of rebuilding something valuable. On the con side, the hurt still raw within me. The knowledge that my worth had been so easily dismissed, the question of whether anything would truly change. Sarah called twice, careful not to pressure me, but clearly hopeful. The worship leader asked about you, she mentioned casually. He said the Easter cantata you organized last year was the highlight of his time at the church. Small acknowledgements like this were emerging now that my absence had made my contributions visible. They were validating, but also frustrating. Why did I have to leave for people to see what had been in front of them all along? On Thursday evening, my doorbell rang unexpectedly. I opened it to find Pastor James's wife, Rebecca, standing on my porch with a casserole dish in her hands. I hope I'm not intruding, she said hesitantly. We used to have lunch sometimes before. I've missed that. It was true. Rebecca and I had shared monthly lunches for years, quiet conversations about books and faith and family that had nothing to do with church operations. Another connection severed when I was asked to leave. I invited her in and we sat at my kitchen table, the casserole cooling between us. Rebecca looked tired, the strain of the church's troubles evident in the new lines around her eyes. James told me he offered you the administrative director position, she said after some careful small talk. He did. She nodded, absently tracing patterns on my tablecloth. You should know, he fought for you. Before. When the board wanted to ask you to step back, he argued that your work was essential even if it wasn't visible on Sunday mornings. This was news to me. In my hurt, I had lumped all church leadership together, seeing them as a united force of rejection rather than individuals with potentially differing views. He didn't fight hard enough, I pointed out, unable to completely suppress the bitterness that still surfaced at unexpected moments. No, Rebecca agreed softly. He didn't, and he knows that now. We sat in silence for a moment before she continued. The thing is, Marie... It's not just about the practical help, though God knows we need that desperately. It's about what your absence represents. And someone who served faithfully for 20 years can be discarded, so easily... It shakes people's faith in the institution, in the community, in leadership. I hadn't considered this wider impact. In my pain, I had focused on my personal relationship with the church, rather than how my departure might have affected others. Perceptions of church values. Several families left explicitly because of how you were treated, Rebecca continued. They said if the church could discard someone like you, they didn't feel safe there either. This revelation hit me harder than expected. The thought that my experience had caused others to question their spiritual home brought no satisfaction, only deeper sadness. What would be different if I came back? I asked, voicing the question that had circled in my mind all week. Would anything actually change? Or would I just be stepping back into the same patterns that led to my dismissal in the first place? Rebecca considered this carefully. The board has changed. 3 members resigned after seeing the consequences of their decisions. The new members are more grounded in the church's mission rather than its image. It was a start, but not necessarily enough. And Pastor James? Has he changed? Rebecca smiled sadly. More than you might think. This experience has humbled him, made him question his priorities, his leadership style. He's been reading books about servant leadership, talking about restructuring church governance to be more collaborative. I wanted to believe this was true, that meaningful change was possible. But skepticism, born of hurt, still clouded my perspective. Words are easy. Actions are what matter. Yes, she agreed. Which is why he wanted me to give you this. She reached into her purse and pulled out an envelope. Inside was a formal letter on church letterhead, signed by all current board members and Pastor James. It wasn't just a job offer. It was a public acknowledgement of error. The letter detailed my contributions over 2 decades, expressed profound regret for the decision to ask me to step back, and outlined specific changes to church governance to ensure such mistakes wouldn't be repeated. This will be read to the congregation on Sunday, Rebecca explained, whether you come back or not. The gesture was unexpected and powerful, not just a private apology, but a public restoration of my reputation and recognition of my value. It represented real accountability, something I hadn't dared to hope for. They're also establishing a volunteer appreciation fund, Rebecca added, named after you, to recognize those whose service might otherwise go unnoticed. Tears welled in my eyes before I could stop them. Not just for the acknowledgement, though that mattered, but for the indication that actual systemic change might be possible. That my painful experience might lead to better treatment for others like me. I still need time, I said, carefully folding the letter and returning it to its envelope. Rebecca reached across the table and squeezed my hand. Of course. No one expects you to decide immediately. Just know that the door is open. More open than it's ever been. After she left, I sat alone in my kitchen for a long time, feeling the weight of decision pressing on me. Going back would not be simple restoration. It would be entering into a changed relationship with a changed institution. Staying away would be simpler in some ways, but also meant abandoning a community that had been central to my life for 2 decades. The question that kept returning wasn't about practicalities or even about healing past hurts. It was deeper. What did true reconciliation look like in this context? Not just forgiveness, but genuine restoration of broken relationships and systems? I had no clear answer as night fell, but for the first time since my departure, I found myself praying for the church and its future, with or without me. Sunday morning dawned clear and cool. I awoke earlier than usual, my mind already active with thoughts of the church service taking place across town. Pastor James would be reading the letter to the congregation today, publicly acknowledging the mistake of my dismissal. I wondered how it would be received, whether it would help heal the fractures that had formed in my absence. I had not yet decided whether to accept the position. The question still hung in the balance, weighted with complexity. Part of me longed for the familiar rhythms of church life, the sense of purpose that came with supporting a mission I believed in. Another part remained wary, protective of the wounds that had only begun to heal. My phone chimed with a text from Sarah. Thinking of you today. No pressure. Just know you're missed. I smiled at her thoughtfulness, then set my phone aside and went to make coffee. As I moved around my kitchen, smaller and quieter than the church kitchen, where I had prepared countless meals, I found myself mentally reviewing the Sunday morning checklist I had followed for years. Heat on by 7 o'clock. Doors unlocked by 8:15. Bulletins distributed to greeters by 8:30. Coffee. Brewing by 8:45. The familiar routine played through my mind like muscle memory, raising an unexpected wave of nostalgia. Despite everything, I missed it. Not just the tasks themselves, but the purpose behind them. The knowledge that my behind-the-scenes work created space for community and worship. Without consciously deciding to do so, I found myself dressing for church. Not in the casual clothes I'd adopted since my departure, but in the modest, neat attire I'd always worn for Sunday service. A simple blue dress, low heels, the pearl earrings my mother had given me. I didn't analyze this impulse too closely. Instead, I followed it, allowing it to lead me to my car and then across town to the familiar white building with its crooked sign. I arrived just as the service was beginning, slipping quietly into a back pew where I could observe without being immediately noticed. The sanctuary was fuller than it had been during my visit the previous Sunday. Word had spread, perhaps, about Pastor James's planned announcement. There was an atmosphere of expectancy, of anticipation for something significant. The worship portion was still struggling, miscues, technical glitches, awkward transitions between songs. But I noticed efforts toward improvement. Someone had dusted the windowsills, the dead plants had been removed. Small signs of renewed care for the physical space. When Pastor James approached the pulpit for announcements, his eyes scanned the congregation briefly before settling on me in the back row. A fleeting expression of surprise crossed his face, followed by something that looked like relief. He nodded slightly in acknowledgement before addressing the gathered community. "Before I begin today's message," he said, his voice steady but humbler than I remembered, "I have an important statement to read on behalf of the church leadership." He unfolded the letter I had seen earlier in the week and began to read. As the words filled the sanctuary, words of acknowledgement, regret, and commitment to change, I watched the congregation's reactions. Some nodded in agreement. Others looked confused, perhaps unaware of the full situation. A few turned to look at me, recognition dawning as they connected the letter's content with my presence. Marie's contributions over 2 decades were fundamental to this church's operations and mission, Pastor James read. Her departure, which we now recognize was handled poorly and resulted from flawed priorities on our part, has revealed the true extent of her value to our community. We extend our sincere apologies not only to Marie, but to the congregation as a whole, for failing to embody the servant leadership we profess to value. The directness of the statement was startling. No euphemisms, no spiritual platitudes to soften the acknowledgement of error. Just straightforward acceptance of responsibility and its consequences. When Pastor James finished reading, he added his own unscripted words. "I want to personally add that this experience has been profoundly humbling for me as your pastor. It has forced me to examine my understanding of leadership and service in ways that have been painful but necessary. I ask for your forgiveness and your patience as we work to rebuild what has been damaged. A murmur ran through the congregation, not disapproval, but something more complex. Recognition, perhaps, of authentic vulnerability from a leader who had previously projected only confidence and certainty. Pastor James then announced the establishment of the Marie Lawson Volunteer Appreciation Fund, explaining its purpose of recognizing behind-the-scenes service that might otherwise go unacknowledged. As he spoke my name, several people turned again to look at me, some with smiles of recognition, others with expressions of dawning understanding about who I was and what I had done. After the service, I remained in my seat as people filed out, unsure of what to do next. My presence felt symbolic in ways I hadn't anticipated. By simply showing up, I had made a statement about possibility, the possibility of reconciliation, of new beginnings after painful endings. Several church members approached to greet me, some awkwardly, others with genuine warmth. "We've missed you," one elderly woman said, clasping my hands in hers. "Nothing's been the same." A young man I recognized from the youth group stopped briefly. "The mission trip this summer was cancelled," he said, disappointment evident in his voice. "No one could figure out how to make it happen without you." These interactions were healing in unexpected ways. Not because they validated my importance, though they did, but because they confirmed that my work had mattered to real people with real needs and hopes. The mission trip wasn't just an item on a spreadsheet. It was a formative experience for young people that hadn't happened because of my absence. As the sanctuary emptied, Pastor James approached cautiously, giving me space to retreat if I wished. When I remained in place, he sat down in the pew beside me, leaving a respectful distance between us. "Thank you for coming today," he said simply. "The letter was thorough," I acknowledged. He nodded. It needed to be. Accountability requires specificity. We sat in silence for a moment, surrounded by the familiar space that held so many shared memories, some painful now, but many still precious. "Have you made a decision?" he asked finally. "About the position?" I looked around the sanctuary, seeing both what it had been and what it could be again. The question wasn't just about a job or even about restoring what had been lost. It was about participating in creating something new from the lessons of the past. "I have conditions," I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. Pastor James turned to me, curiosity and hope mingling in his expression. "I'm listening." My conditions were straightforward but fundamental. I would return not just as an employee, but as part of a restructured leadership team with authority to implement systems of accountability and recognition. The Volunteer Appreciation Fund would be expanded into a comprehensive program that identified, supported, and valued behind-the-scenes work throughout the church. And most importantly, church governance would be reformed to include diverse voices, particularly those like mine that had been historically underrepresented in decision-making. "These aren't just about me," I explained as Pastor James listened attentively. "They're about ensuring that what happened to me doesn't happen to others. About building a church culture that truly values all forms of service and contribution, not just the visible ones." Pastor James didn't hesitate. "I agree to all of it. The board will too. How can you be so sure?" I asked, skeptical of such ready acceptance. "Because we've seen the alternative," he said simply. "We've experienced what happens when we devalue the foundation that supports everything else. That conversation took place 3 months ago. Today, as I stand in the church kitchen preparing coffee for the Sunday morning crowd, I'm struck by how much has changed and how much remains familiar. The physical spaces have been rejuvenated through community workdays. The finances are stabilizing, though it will take time to fully recover from the deficit that developed in my absence. Programs are being rebuilt, relationships mended, trusts slowly restored. My role has evolved beyond what it was before. I still maintain the systems and attend to details, but now I do so with explicit recognition and authority. The nameplate on my office door reads, Executive Director of Operations, a title that acknowledges both the scope and importance of my work. More significantly, I now train others in what I do, documenting processes and mentoring volunteers to ensure that the church never again becomes dependent on any single person's unacknowledged contributions. The systems I build today are designed to be transparent, accessible, and sustainable. The Volunteer Appreciation Program has identified dozens of people whose quiet service had previously gone unrecognized. Monthly, we highlight these individuals in the church bulletin and during services. The recognition isn't flashy, that would miss the point, but it's meaningful, creating a culture where invisible work becomes visible enough to be valued. Church governance has been transformed through a new council structure that includes representatives from all aspects of church life, not just the prominent ministries, but also the support functions, the maintenance work, the administrative tasks that keep everything running. Every voice carries equal weight in decisions about direction and priorities. Pastor James has changed too. The humbling experience of watching his church nearly collapse has shifted something fundamental in his understanding of leadership. He listens more than he speaks in meetings now. He asks questions rather than making pronouncements. He has become a student of servant leadership in practice, not just in theory. Our relationship has found a new equilibrium, not without occasional tension, but grounded in mutual respect that was missing before. We meet weekly to align our work and address emerging issues. These conversations are direct and honest in ways they never were in the past. The congregation has largely returned, drawn back by evidence of genuine change and renewed commitment to the church's core mission. Some faces are missing, wounds that ran too deep to heal, paths that diverged too far to reconnect. I carry awareness of these permanent losses as a reminder of what's at stake in building healthy community. New faces have appeared as well, often referred by members who share stories of transformation and renewal. This is a place that learned from its mistakes. I overhear one longtime member telling a visitor, "That makes it stronger than it was before." I don't know if that's true yet. Learning from mistakes doesn't automatically translate to lasting change. The real test will come with time, with transitions, with the inevitable challenges that face any community of imperfect humans trying to live out shared values. What I do know is that reconciliation is more complex than I once imagined. It's not a moment, but a process. Not an event, but a journey. It requires not just forgiveness, but reformation. Not just healing, but transformation of the conditions that caused harm. As I carry the coffee urns into the fellowship hall, where early arrivals are already gathering, Sarah catches my eye from across the room and smiles. She was right to keep calling during those months of exile, to maintain the connection that eventually became a bridge back. Some relationships transcend institutional boundaries, creating possibilities for healing that might otherwise remain closed. The church is not the same as it was before my departure. Neither am I. We have both been changed by the breaking and the rebuilding. There are scars that will always remain, memories that still carry pain alongside the joy. But there is also new growth, stronger for having been tested, more resilient for having faced collapse. As people begin to fill the space, greeting each other with the familiar warmth of community, I survey the scene with complex emotions. Pride in what has been rebuilt, lingering sadness for what was lost, hope for what might still become, and beneath it all, a quiet certainty that my work matters. Not because everyone now sees and acknowledges it, though many do, but because it always mattered, even when it was invisible. The greatest revelation wasn't that they needed me, it was that true reconciliation required change on both sides. What appeared to be my story of vindication transformed into something far more meaningful. A community's journey toward authentic transformation. When they expelled me and the church began to crumble, the easy ending would have been triumphant return on my terms. Instead, we discovered a harder truth, that genuine healing demands not just acknowledgement of past wrongs, but commitment to a fundamentally different future. The church didn't just need my skills back. It needed to become a place where such skills would never again be devalued. In rebuilding what was broken, we created something new. Not perfect, still human, still flawed, but intentionally structured to value all contributions. To see the invisible work that sustains community. To recognize that foundations matter precisely because they aren't meant to be seen. The true miracle wasn't that they finally saw my worth, it was that, together, we learned to see differently.